All right, so let's kick it off slowly. Welcome to the December edition of the Denver Erlang Elixir meetup. And as the lovely lady told you, we are recording this for whoever on YouTube and posterity would be interested in reliving this lovely experience. A note, I've been organizing this sucker for many moons now and kind of need a break. So we're looking for some help. Michael said you'd be willing to do some help. That is great. We have other organizers who do help out. But if someone would like to take the reins and do monthly presenting, that would be super appreciated. And that at this point seems like it's going to be online because we seem to have the biggest community online. So right now that's the path, but whoever wants to lead can lead us where he or she wants to go. So opportunity there, but I've not canceled meetings for next year, but if someone wants to do that, just talk to the organizers and we can happily hook you up. It's really not that hard. It's not a lot of time commitment. You do just have to find a speaker and then one evening a month, you run the Zoom. Oh, you might need a Zoom.
Can I add in a little on that, Brett?
You certainly can.
Awesome. Yeah. So as Jeff said, first off, thank you. You basically took the hardest years of this by being the main driver during the pandemic. So we
Glad to have done it.
super appreciate that. And so people are probably aware there's multiple organizers here. Brett is for the last few years has been the main driver. Before that, it was kind of me. And I'm still around helping, but we still need somebody to step into the main driver's seat. Yeah, there are Jeff Smith and I and a couple other people are around to continue to help and assist, but we are looking for somebody who has the energy to be kind of the face, the front runner on this.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. So and Brett is saying it nicely, but frankly, if we can't get somebody to step up, although it sounds like there's conversations to be had, and I appreciate that already, this meetup will not keep going. And I think we've been doing what's a pretty. I mean, I got involved in maybe 2015. And
was that with Bradley?
I think that's when we turned it into we moved it from Erlang to
yes.
Erlang and Elixir. And this has been one of the most successful Elixir and just Beam meetups running and longest running. We've got a really great group and would love to just continue to see it being successful. So again, I understand there's Michael, maybe I think you said was saying offering some help, but anyway, yeah, we just we need some new energy.
Yep. Somebody to basically be the responsible party. Again, we do have lots of other organizers who do help out, who can probably help maybe find
and we source
or even
speakers and whatnot, and we will and we do some speaking and whatnot, but again, it's really helpful to have a solo or a single person who's actually the head driver. So
yep, who we know is going to show up on Monday and run the Zoom. So anyway, it would be super helpful. Reach out to us. We'd love more help to keep it going. All right. So we did have a main speaker who sadly is having some other personal issues, so was not able to come. So it is the Rowland show. Did I spell it right? Okay, good. I screwed it up last time. So who's talking about streaming but not parsing evidently CSVs. True, right?
Oh, we're encoding them, so we're formatting them rather than parsing them, thankfully.
All right, we will see. I will stop sharing, hand you the screen, and you can illuminate us with what you have discovered.
All right, so you should see an empty browser screen. Okay, great. So recently I needed to export a lot of data to a CSV. We're talking 100 plus columns, unbounded number of rows. And I was really concerned that I was just going to blow up my server and run it out of memory. So I was reading through the Ecto documentation and I found repo.stream. So repo.stream will take a query and return a lazy enumerable, what we might think of as a stream in the Elixir parlance, that allows us to iterate on that later. So if you run repo.all, you get everything immediately and it tries to load it all into memory at once. With stream, we can kind of decide how we want to pull that data from the database a little bit more intelligently. So it looks something like this, where we have a big expensive query and we can pass it to our repo.stream and it'll give us back a function that we can then call in various ways to get that data out later. Well, this solved one of my problems, which is fetching the data from the database, but it didn't solve my other problem, which is how do I actually send it to a client? Because if I can't send it to the client in some kind of streamed way, then I still have to load it all into memory, which like I got it out of the database in a streamed way, but that doesn't solve my problem ultimately. So I was discussing this with a colleague and they suggested send chunked, which is a function on plug.conf. It's automatically imported by Phoenix, the same way that send rest header, send response is. And what it'll do is it'll send a response code, a status code, and it'll set an expectation with the client that you're going to send more data in chunks. And then you can use chunk/2 to actually send that data piece by piece. And what that looks like is we can reduce over the data into our con as an accumulator. So it looks something like this. So we have our stream and we can say reduce over it, collect into our connection on each piece of data that we care about, call the chunk function on that data. And this little kind of OKCon error close allows it to kind of handle what happens if the stream gets broken, if it gets interrupted. You can do it. It recommends against it, but you can technically do it with enum.into, but it recommends to use reduce while in case it needs to abort in the middle.
Can I assume the enum into would also just throw it on the memory as well?
No. So
Okay.
it's accumulating it into the connection, but send chunked, the chunk function, it depends on the implementation you're using. So either plug cowboy or something like bandit, it's Phoenix adapter or whatever you're using to power plug, because this is a callback, is doing that kind of as a side effectful function. So it's sending that data immediately to a socket and forgetting about it. And then the connection is the updated, but it's really the only piece that needs to be updated in the connection struct, to my knowledge, is like setting it from chunked mode, because it sets it to state chunked to state sent. I think that's how that works, but it only has in memory that piece that you're sending in the chunk right now, which is exactly what I need for my case of let me not blow up my server with my massive amounts of CSV data. Is that straightforward?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay. So now so those are the two pieces I need. I needed to pull the data from the database. I needed some way to send it to the client. Thankfully, CSV.encode, so no, this is formatting rather than parsing, thankfully, as it takes an enumerable and returns an enumerable. So I can just slot it in the middle of my pipes and it doesn't care. Like I can just take the stream, pass it into CSV encode, and then pass that directly into my enum.reduce while from before, and I'm good to go. One more thing, which is that for Ecto SQL adapters, if you're doing a repo.stream, it has to be in a repo.transaction. Like it cannot execute unless you're inside of a transaction. What that looks like is something like this. So this is kind of what a module for our thing might look like. So we have our connection. We set our response header to text CSV. We put a response header that says, hey, we've got an attachment. We're going to call it data. Our send chunk sends our response code. And then in our export function, We then wrap the whole thing in a repo.transaction just with an anonymous function, no arguments. You can use arguments in this function to do things with the repo, but it's kind of unnecessary for this big expensive query into a stream, into encode, into a reduce while. And that's it. Right? If you plop this code into my project dot export controller, you could just you just rename this to whatever path you want it to be in your router, and you can just export right then and there. So this gets me exactly what I need. It will stream the data row by row to a CSV, and now I have a working way of doing that. However, you might not want to stream it one row of a CSV at a time. If you've got 100,000 rows, that might take a while. And it's kind of a little bit inefficient. So what you can do is you can actually throw in a stream.chunkevery right before the enum.reduce while, and take advantage of the fact that repo.stream has a max rows parameter. That allows you to kind of set a batch size on both the repo.stream, and the stream.chunkevery will also kind of batch up your pieces. So that'll look something like this. So big expensive query, repo.stream with our batch size on the max rows. Max rows specifically is the maximum number of rows that you can retrieve from the database in a single step. So it'll let you do it row by row, but it defaults to 500, and you can set it to whatever you want. In this case, we can do chunkevery and then pass it to reduce while. One thing to note is that chunk will happily take that data as a list of strings rather than a string, because the plug.con callback is supposed to implement the IO data type. So it should handle both direct strings as well as IO lists, of which a list of strings counts. And I have personally verified that this works with plug.cowboy in the current version, and it should be supported by Bandit in the next release that they do. A couple other notes. One, any transaction in Ecto has a timeout that defaults to 15 milliseconds or 15 seconds, so 15,000 milliseconds. You may want to set that a bit higher if you're pulling a lot of data from your database, because it'll time out. And then the final one is just a kind of a gotcha. The CSV.encode takes a headers parameter, not a header parameter. And this is kind of annoying because it returns a stream and not a list. It's really hard to tell that it did it wrong. And the error message it gives you when you pass in header rather than headers is entirely unhelpful to help you determine that that was what the issue was. So that was a kind of a heads up. So that's what I have. If you're interested in learning more, I have a blog post, which I'll link in the chat in a moment, as well as a demonstration repo on GitHub that has a Phoenix application that implements controller here. In this case, I just took my big expensive query. I have a kind of very boring insert in the seeds file. And what it does is I cross join on itself twice. So there's 1,000 rows in the database, and I cross join on those. And so in theory, this would send you 1 billion rows of data. I added in a stream.take 10,000 so that if you decide to run this on your own, you're not sitting there for 3 hours waiting for Phoenix to slowly send you 1 billion rows, 100 or 500 at a time. I've been Rowland Carlson. My website is row.land, and my email is on there if you're interested in contacting me. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Anybody have questions for Rowland? Oh, look at this. Hey, Jeffrey, then Jeff, huh?
All right, it's Rowland. So where's our profiling of you running this job and showing us the memory usage?
I wasn't quite. I don't know how to do benchmarking well, so I didn't do that. However, I do have a kind of follow-up project that I'm not going to mention on the recording that might involve me learning how to do that skill. So to be determined.
Yeah, no, that's great. And you know, obviously I was just having fun with you. You definitely tend to be focused on data driven decisions. And so obviously, you know, I'm aware that this is working for you because your shit's not crashing. Right. But yeah, I was definitely hoping to see some numbers. So I think one of the things that you should work on, and I'm happy to dig into it with you too, is actually focus on a memory standpoint for the profiling.
Absolutely.
Sweet.
Jeff?
So it's kind of an extension of Jeffrey's question, but probably easier to answer because I think you lived it, which is how large was the file that you needed to do for work? Like how many rows did that end up resulting in?
Not that many now. It's kind of future proofing. So
Gotcha.
it's kind of a mass export across a number of different domains in the application. And so it doesn't have that many users yet, so that it's not very long, but I know it's going to. And I don't want it to blow up in the middle of the night while a client's trying to export it and we have to wake up and restart the instance and figure out what went wrong. So this is just going, okay, I know this is going to happen. I know there's going to be a lot of data. Here's how I'm handling it. That does lead me to one of my kind of questions I wanted to ask the audience, which is one of the suggestions I was given is that it might time out on the connection side. So like the transaction, you can set a timeout longer, but if it times out on the connection side, it's a CSV. So there's like no clear indicator that the file failed to send other than that it didn't send the null byte at the end of the HTTP request. So I don't know how well this responds to like a crappy connection, right? If your connection gets interrupted while you're exporting, because it's a CSV in particular, it doesn't have any like kind of error correction codes built into it to handle bad data. And I don't know how it responds to a restart, like whether it just starts at the beginning again or whether it picks up where it continues or otherwise.
That's a
Could you
really
do like a checksum on like the number of lines in the file, for example, and then like send that and like make sure they match?
Well, the problem is I don't know how many lines there are because I'm streaming from the
Okay.
database.
Right.
Like by definition, I kind of don't want to know how many there are all at once.
But yeah, but then it's hard to like checksum it. Okay, yeah.
Jeff.
So that you're mentioning that for a crappy connection brings up to mind another failed state, which would be, or maybe you mentioned it, and that's how it got into my head, would be across deploys. If you have something that's like bouncing all of your instances, they'll get a polite shutdown reminder. But if you're streaming for 15, 30 seconds, a whole minute and a half, you're probably going to get a forceful shutdown at that point, and not a great way of telling the client what went wrong.
I can, so that's a good point. I can confirm that if the Phoenix code errors, like the plug code errors, it will actually cancel the download. And like in Chrome, you'll get this file failed to download in the downloads bar. So I know that behavior is handled well by the browser, at least Chrome. But I really don't know. That's an interesting question.
I'm curious about the batching need for batching, if that's needed. I don't remember. I've probably done something like this, but it was probably back in my Ruby days. But if you have an open connection and you're writing a line into it, you write another line, you write another line, it doesn't seem like there's really a hang up there. Like, what is the benefit, or did you benchmark between batching versus just streaming line after line?
I did not benchmark, but I can say, looking into the implementation of how a chunk is encoded into HTTP, which is a thing I did, I definitely explored the source code, Jeffrey. So no benchmarking, but there's definitely source code reading.
I'm sorry if you felt offensive. I think you're awesome.
It's great.
But you have,
it gives me a new level to raise to.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've constantly set blown out my expectations or gone above my expectations with stuff. So I was just, I didn't know I was asking you for anything that would put you on the defense. Sorry, friend.
No, it's fine. No, but I have read the implementations, both the Cowboy implementation is a little bit hard to read because he uses message passing to implement the behavior. But in Bandit, which is the Elixir kind of drop-in replacement for Cowboy, it's just a socket.send, and it's an IO list with the byte size, and then a new line, a carriage return, the data, and then a new line of carriage return. That's what the HTTP specification for a chunk is. So if you're sending it row by row, you're going to get a whole bunch more new line characters, but like that's 4 bytes per chunk. It's not all that expensive. There's probably a power saving argument to do it in larger batches. My bigger concern is around the database latency, right? So pulling out a row, 1 row at a time. If I have, like a lot of systems, I don't know how Fly.io does this, but I know on GigElixir, I'm pretty sure the Postgres database is not on the same machine as the Phoenix installation. And so there's a bit of latency between the app and the database. So you may want to batch it just so that you're not dealing with that, but I don't have specific benchmarks to address that question.
I mean, it makes sense to just ask the database for a chunk of stuff. Why make it do all this work? Yeah. Thanks.
The other thing that came up when I was researching this is that I have to wrap everything in a repo.transaction, which means I now have a repo.transaction in my controller, which is kind of a muddling of abstraction layers. So I wanted to kind of ask ideas. I know Jeff has one, but what other ideas there are for addressing, like, is it okay to have a repo.transaction in my controller? If I'm doing it for just one CSV export, probably fine to leave it there. But if I'm doing this a bunch of different ways throughout my application, how would I want to handle that?
That was actually my backup question, or my other question was, you're doing repo stuff right in the controller, and any reasonably sized app probably has a rule against that. You're using context. And so, like, theoretically, though, you could have the context, the database layer pass up a stream, and it's not realized until you invoke it in the controller. But that was all very fast, so I don't have a picture of that in my head.
Well, so the problem is you can't invoke that stream from the database outside of a repo.transaction.
Right.
So you have to be in that transaction context, period,
But
to evaluate that stream.
The context level function can call repo, so it does repo.transaction inside there, creating a stream, but none of that actually gets invoked. Like if it returns a stream, then none of it gets invoked until you call an enum function on that stream, right? I think I might be.
That's an interesting question. What I'm understanding from Ben is he's saying, if we just wrap repo.stream and a repo.transaction in, say, my context layer, and then pass, and it returns a stream from that function, can I then evaluate that second stream later? And I don't know that you can, because it specifically talks about enumerating the repo.transaction, like the repo.stream at all has to be inside. It's like I'm not calling enum until later. And I think I tried that and it didn't work, but I don't remember specifically if I tried this particular implementation.
Right. So places where I've done repo.transaction with repo.stream inside the function that repo transaction is getting, I'm doing like enum.count or enum.something, which reifies the stream and makes it that the thing actually do something. So how you can pass that, I guess you'd pass the function up. And so the controller layer doesn't need to know the repo dirt. It just invokes the function that will start a transaction and a stream and whatever you call that, reify it, like make it real. I don't know if I'm off on a tangent here.
Yeah, I'm going to cheat a little because Jeffrey, you had something there, I think.
Oh, no, you're good. Go for it.
Okay.
I want to hear you cheating.
Jeff and I discussed this ahead of time when I practiced the talk. So I'm going to sound smart by borrowing his ideas. But the suggestion he gave is that you essentially do the opposite of what you were just suggesting, Ben. So you have a module that implements a function that takes in an accumulator and a iterating function, like the reduce while takes that anonymous function that includes chunk in it. If I generate that anonymous function, or maybe even just make it a module function arity and send that all at once inside of the controller, and then pass that down to a module that's expecting just any accumulator and any function that then invokes repo.transaction, then I can essentially, I'm using dependency injection to avoid that kind of mixing of abstraction layers.
Which in the end, though, is really just a symbolic victory, because you're dealing with a pretty complex thing here where the code separation, to be very clear, I love that you're pushing for clean clean design on your stuff. I like that you're being intentional and you're trying to respect those limits, but it sounds to me like there's actually a technical limitation that no matter what is going to make this a little bit difficult. A lot of the reasons why we do this is maintainability and predictability and readability, right? And so it sounds like that to me sounds like a good direction to go and to be playing around, but it still doesn't quite get it to that really simple thing we're doing, because you're doing a not simple thing, right?
That was also Jeff's words. So that was the thing we landed on.
Yeah.
Is if we're doing this once, right? If I'm just exporting CSVs and I'm passing in the query every time, and otherwise it's the same function getting called, right? I am doing a muddy thing, which is taking data directly in a pipeline and passing it straight over an HTTP connection to the client, right? Like I'm already by default mixing abstraction layers because that's the only way I'm allowed to do it lazily, right? And so having it directly in there is more readable, because it's like clear what's going on. All of my functions are right there in the controller. I'm calling a query. I'm passing it to repo.stream. I'm encoding it as a CSV. I'm grabbing them in chunks of 500, and then I'm sending it to my client. And that's it. Right? You can see exactly what it's doing in 10 lines of code. I think having it separated into a different module with that kind of avoiding the abstraction muddling only makes sense if you're going to be exporting on a number of different paths and controllers throughout the application, right?
Yeah,
if I've got
I like that.
1,000 different ways in which I'm exporting CSVs, and all of them have kind of bespoke qualities to them and paths and parameters, then it might make sense to don't repeat yourself at that point. Like abstract out the logic that does the streaming from the database and then call it out. The nice thing about that is that you can avoid telling the controller where the data is coming from. So you could theoretically be streaming from another API or from a key value store rather than from an ecto query.
Yeah, no, that's a great call out. Back to and I'm thinking about it from a testing approach too. It just comes back down to, again, if you're doing multiple of them, then that code being reusable is worth it. Otherwise, while normally I'm a big fan of breaking things out into predictable pieces and individually testing the smaller chunks of stuff, this is a pain in the test, right? And so that goes back to, it just depends on how many times you're going to do this. If you're doing it the once, this is one of the few times where you'll hear me actually probably advocating for a more complex controller action. But no, that's cool. And this is the kind of stuff where, like, when I'm encouraging people to expand their knowledge, it's like, go solve your own problems. It's not until we come across weird shit like this that we really have to stretch and push ourselves to think about to actually, like, recognize, that we can go look at all the sample code from everybody else we ever want to, but it's only when we're actually solving our one-off cases that we actually really have to start doing some real problem solving, and that's when things get interesting. So this has been a good conversation.
And I have to give credit to Matt Trudell, who's the maintainer of Bandit, because I did try to use Bandit as a drop-in replacement for Cowboy, and the hex version of Bandit currently does not support IO list input on chunk because it was using byte size, which expects a bit string. So you have to replace it with IO data length, which is an inline version of Erlang.io list size, which itself is a BIF written in very highly optimized C. It has go-tos in it. I know it looks ugly and awful. because I was trying to figure out like, okay, is it okay to replace byte size with an IO data list length type operation? Because one of the concerns is that byte size is probably O of 1, whereas IO data length is probably O of n, but it's a BIF. It's about as fast as you possibly can get it. It's implemented directly into, like, it's in the utils function in the Beam virtual machine. Like, it's not even a NIF BIF compiled elsewhere. It's literally in the implementation of the virtual machine. And the final understanding, and this was something that Matt responded with, is that it's O of n on the number of things in the IO list, not the length of the strings contained in the IO list. So if I have that list of 500 strings, it's O of 500, not O of however long each of those strings is concatenated 500 times.
Cool.
Yeah.
Any
And
other?
that pull request is already merged to finish out the thing. So we
Oh,
discussed
right.
that, got in a fix. It's already merged, so it'll be in the next release.
That's awesome.
That's cool.
Nice. I
Have
think
you-
we're all pretty excited about Bandit in general. So so thank you for helping that be a even more successful project.
Definitely. I was
Is
gonna ask-
that production ready?
I was gonna ask if you had a chance to play with it some before you ran into that problem, Roland.
I mean, once you throw in that fix, and I verified that both by pulling it down from main on GitHub, as well as going into my deps folder and manually changing that line, it works fine. It'll stream out the CSV without any issues, no complaints. So it seems to work perfectly
And my
well for my
understanding
purposes.
is that if you're not stretching it, if you're just doing normal stuff, and if you're not using WebSockets, that it's it is, in
WebSockets are
fact,
currently in the current version of Bandit. So Bandit now implements fully compliant WebSockets as of
hot
it's
damn.
on 0.6.2, I think.
Yeah.
So in the current version, it implements everything you would need to be a drop-in replacement for Cowboy in Phoenix, as long as you're in Phoenix, like I think 1.7 or later. Now there's going to be
Yeah.
rough edges like what I found, but nobody's
Yeah.
using chunk in Phoenix.
Yeah.
That's my I have things to talk about after recording about that subject.
Yeah, I got very excited about Bandit at ElixirConf 2021 after Trudel's talk, and went home and tried to to use it in Phoenix and discovered that no, Phoenix doesn't. At that time, Phoenix didn't. It was locked to Cowboy. So
Yeah.
great that it 1.7 will allow you to swap out the HTTP.
Yeah, and it's really easy to add it in. So in the demo repo, which I'll link in chat here in a moment, I actually have a commented outed line in the config, which it literally is like adapter : bandit.phoenix adapter, I think is the module. And you throw that in your HTTP endpoint config in config.exs. And congratulations, you're using Bandit, not Cowboy anymore. And everything just works from what I've seen. Barring the one issue, which is now fixed.
That's awesome. And I'm kind of stepping around something. The author of Cowboy is somewhat toxic compared to the way that we try to run the community. So that's the reason why I personally am incentivized to be able to use a replacement in the long
Brett,
run.
would we like to end the recording so we can talk a little bit
So you can talk
more freely here?
We certainly can.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. I'm also comfortable having my opinions put onto a recording, but that said, I can understand why not everybody else would be in that same place. So
That's fair. We can talk after we're done
Yeah.
recording.
cool.
Any other discussion related to this? Otherwise, I'm going to move on and see if there's any show and tell. No. Okay. Anybody have any code or projects that they'd like to share with the group?
I do have a small shout out real fast, and that was last month when I presented or when Jeff and I presented the checker cab stuff. I mentioned that there was a issue there to actually improve the test output or the failure output and it turned out that before the meetup was even over, we had a pull request in from Solomon that addressed that. And Jeff and I have gone through it, and it's great. And we'll be releasing a updated version, or the next version of Checker Cab really soon, that includes that. So thank you, Solomon.
Live coding. That's amazing.
Sure thing. It was fun.
All right. Hearing no other contributions, I'll turn off the recording. Oh, you got something, Mike? What's up?
I just have a quick little plug. I am starting an accountability group for people who are working like on an Elixir side project. That kind of is like a place to kind of come and have different events where we kind of talk about like our side projects and our goals and our challenges and things of that nature. I have a blog post that you guys can check out for more info on my website, which is mikazornik.com for the recording, should people visit that.
I'll put that in Slack too.
Yeah, but if you're interested, definitely let me know. If you have any other feedback, would love to hear it. Thanks.
Cool.
Nice.
Sounds pretty useful.
Well, in general, I
Wow.
find that Mike is one of the people who's just constantly pushing community, like things to grow the community. So thank you for the energy you put into trying to raise us all up. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right, what's that, Michael waving or?
Oh yeah, I'll go.
Sure.
So I've been putting some articles up on the blog, mostly about like OWASP vulnerabilities, like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, but those are really specific. One recent blog post I wrote was just tips for getting started, like securing your Elixir and Phoenix application, which people seem to like because it's things like Solo, but also checking for vulnerable dependencies. There's a plug for Praxial, of course, but just like the first steps you would take for like if you have to start somewhere, like securing a Phoenix application from scratch.
Cool. All right, paste that in there too. Take a look. Yeah, sounds like that'd be an interesting talk. All right, any other contributions, discussions? Otherwise, I'll pull the trigger. All right, thanks for coming, everybody. And we're done with that part.